Imagine a train moving through the dark English countryside, carrying millions of pounds in cash. To most people, it was simply another Royal Mail train traveling from Glasgow toward London. But on the night of August 7, 1963, this train became the target of one of the most daring and carefully planned robberies in British history. Welcome to Xfinity Evolution, where history comes alive and legends are reborn. The crime would become known as the Great Train Robbery, and it would shock an entire nation. The story began with a group of professional criminals who had spent months planning the perfect attack. Their leader was Bruce Reynolds, an experienced robber who understood that stopping a heavily protected mail train would require more than weapons and force. The gang studied the railway system, watched the train's movements, and identified a remote location near Mentmore in Buckinghamshire. They knew the train carried huge amounts of cash being transported between banks, and they knew exactly when it was expected to pass through the area. Their plan depended on one thing: stopping the train without raising an alarm. In the early hours of August 8th, their plan went into action. The gang tampered with a railway signal, using a battery-powered device to make the signal appear red. When the train approached, driver Jack Mills saw the red light and brought the locomotive to a stop. He had no idea that the signal had been deliberately changed. When Mills stepped down from the locomotive to investigate, the criminals attacked him and knocked him unconscious. Within moments, the gang had taken control of the train. The robbers now faced their biggest challenge. The money was stored in mail coaches toward the front of the train, and they needed to move it quickly. They forced the train crew to help them move the locomotive and several coaches to a nearby bridge. There, the gang began unloading the mail bags. The operation was surprisingly organized. Bags were carried from the train and passed down to waiting vehicles while other members of the gang kept watch. They knew that every minute mattered. If a police officer or railway worker arrived, the entire operation could collapse. In roughly half an hour, the criminals had taken what was then an astonishing amount of money, approximately £2.6 million. Adjusted for inflation and modern values, that would represent tens of millions of pounds today. The gang quickly loaded the stolen cash into vehicles and escaped into the countryside. For a brief moment, it looked like they had achieved the perfect robbery. A heavily guarded train had been stopped, millions had been stolen, and the criminals had disappeared into the darkness. But the gang had made a serious mistake. They needed somewhere to hide while they divided the money and waited for the investigation to slow down. They escaped to a farmhouse called Leatherslade Farm, believing that the remote location would keep them hidden. Instead, it became one of the biggest clues in the entire investigation. Police began searching for evidence, interviewing witnesses, tracing vehicles, and examining everything connected to the crime. Eventually, investigators discovered the farmhouse. Inside, police found evidence that the criminals had been there. And among the clues were fingerprints. The gang had attempted to clean up the location, but they had overlooked important evidence. Investigators also discovered something almost unbelievable. The robbers had been playing Monopoly at the farmhouse. Their fingerprints and other evidence helped police identify members of the gang, and the massive investigation began closing in on them. Several members were arrested and eventually sentenced to long prison terms. Among the most famous was Ronnie Biggs, who later became known around the world for escaping from prison. In 1965, Biggs climbed over a prison wall and disappeared. He eventually fled Britain and spent decades living abroad, becoming one of the most famous fugitives associated with the robbery. Other members of the gang also managed to avoid capture for periods of time, but the pressure of the investigation continued to follow them. What made the Great Train Robbery so fascinating was not simply the amount of money that was stolen. It was the scale and organization of the operation. The criminals had studied the railway, selected their location, manipulated the signal, coordinated the attack, and prepared an escape route. For a short time, they appeared to be one step ahead of the authorities. But the robbery also showed how quickly a carefully planned crime can begin to fall apart when criminals leave behind even the smallest piece of evidence. The robbery also had a human cost. Train driver Jack Mills suffered serious injuries during the attack, and the event changed railway security and public perceptions of organized crime in Britain. The criminals may have become famous, but their lives were far from the glamorous image created by newspapers and films. Many spent years in prison, relationships collapsed, money disappeared, and the consequences of that single night followed them for decades. The Great Train Robbery eventually became more than just a criminal investigation. It became a legendary story that inspired books, documentaries, and films. Names like Bruce Reynolds, Ronnie Biggs, and Buster Edwards became permanently connected to one of the most famous heists in history. Yet the real story is a reminder that even the most carefully planned robbery has weaknesses. The criminals thought they had beaten the system. They had millions of pounds, a remote hideout, and a head start. But they underestimated one thing: the patience of investigators. Police didn't need to catch them that night. They only needed to follow the clues. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson of the Great Train Robbery. The perfect crime doesn't exist. A criminal can plan every detail, control every moment, and disappear with a fortune. But one fingerprint, one mistake, or one forgotten piece of evidence can eventually bring everything crashing down. On that August night in 1963, a group of criminals stopped a train and stole millions. But they couldn't stop the investigation that followed. The money disappeared quickly. The fugitives ran for years. Yet the story survived, and more than 6 decades later, the Great Train Robbery remains one of the most extraordinary and infamous train heists the world has ever seen. If you want to understand how history is unfolding before our eyes, don't miss what comes next. Revisit Xfinity Evolution for deeper insights and powerful stories. Stay informed, stay curious, and join us again on Xfinity Evolution, where the world's biggest events come into focus.